Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will begin with chapter 13, verse 2. The bulk, it's double parsha this week, the bulk of both parshios has to do with treatment of the Metzora, of the person who has tzaras. Tzaras is loosely translated as leprosy, but there are various halachos about it. Now, an interesting technical point, not really going to see anything on this, but there's the opening section of this week's parsha. One of the main points, the opening section of this week's parsha, is the mitzvah of bris, the mitzvah of circumcision. And we basically go from bris and associated things have to do with the purity of woman after she gives birth to the topic of tzaras. So sort of an obvious question, is there a meaning behind that juxtaposition? So let's start with the Kli Yakar. Kli Yakar on Pasuk Beis, chapter 13, verse 2, Kli Yakar. Adam ki yavor b'saro. Somach parshas negoyim leparsha kodemes hamdaberes b'mila. That the Torah juxtaposes the discussion of tzaras, the discussion of bris. Lomar lach to teach you, shamila dochas hanagoyim. It's a famous discussion the Gemara talks about. We're prohibited from cutting off a mark from our skin of tzaras. It's actually, when you think about it, if you understand for a moment that this leprosy is a message from God, there's something very powerful that you have to do something about it. You can't just cut it off. It's an interesting, like a symbolic thing to think about. But in any event, whether you go with that idea or not, there's a Torah prohibition of cutting off the mark, the skin that has the mark of tzaras on it. So there's an interesting question that the Gemara grapples with. Let's say there's a baby born and there's a mark of tzaras on the foreskin. So does one do the circumcision? Does one not do the circumcision? So we say that the mitzvah of circumcision overrides the prohibition of cutting off the mark of the tzaras. He says the general rule is when we have two mitzvahs juxtaposed one to another, the first one overrides the second. There are famous examples about Shabbos, that Shabbos is juxtaposed to honoring one's parents. Shabbos is juxtaposed to work on the Mishkan. And he says the general rule is that whichever mitzvah comes first is the one that overrides the other. Okay. The Altzara Remes, Nira Lefarish, Kmoshamru Razal, Gedola Mila, Shadochas Hanagoyim, Vishistam Mila, Siba, Lemilas Kol Arba Orlos, Michlalam Orlas Hapeh. But now he wants to look at it in more of a symbolic way, that the idea of cutting off the foreskin, the idea of the circumcision, is representative of other types of blockages. And one of them is the orla, is the, symbolically speaking, the foreskin, the blockage of the mouth. If a person's mouth becomes elevated, lo yisaper lashon hara, v'yas lo yavel lidei negoyim aboyim al lashon hara. We're going to see numerous references to this week. That the most famous reason a person would get tzaras is its punishment for lashon hara, for speaking ill of others. The most famous example of this in Chumash is, of course, Miriam, that we're taught that Miriam had marks of tzaras after she spoke ill of Moshe Rabbeinu. So he says that the symbolism of cutting off the foreskin has to do with devoting ourselves to God in different ways, and one of them is the manner in which we speak. So if a person's had their mind straight regarding how one should speak through the circumcision, they wouldn't have to worry about tzaras. Okay, this is, I don't think we're going to get into that. Okay, let's skip to the next Kli Yakar. It's the next piece of the Kli Yakar is the pasuk describes different types of marks of tzaras, and on that the Kli Yakar says, there's all kinds of opinions regarding why one would not have tzaras, why one would have tzaras. Ki yesh omrim shem choli tivi nistar b'soch haguf haguf u'mevatz beitz lachutz. Some say that it's some kind of physical malady. Even if you say that, presumably it's not what we think of as leprosy today, but that it's some kind of physical malady. And some say that this is a message from God, that when a person has tzaras, it's a message is being conveyed that there's ills within the person, and that's why they have marks on themselves. Ubein kach, nearly lefarish lashon metzora, she mila murkeves. He says, whatever you'd say about this, I think the word metzora is the term for the person who has tzaras. He says, I think we can define metzora as being, I think it's called a compound word. All the retired elementary school teachers, I think it's called a compound word. Motzi ra, metzora, motzi ra, a person who brings out ill. Shemegale umotzi lachutz kol raso shebekirbo. That whatever ills are inside of a person are now coming to the fore. Heino ipush hapnimi, whether it be that there are some inner ills within the person. Hein imhumaki re'eu basaser b'shot l'shono ve'nabrios yoden lishamrim mimenu. Whether it be that the person's own character is just off, or the person is striking at people in a hidden way, is speaking up about people in a negative way, they don't even know it. Okay, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu mefarsem al hachanefim umotzi kol ra'aso lachutz k'dei shetigale ra'aso b'kol. And therefore, God pushes all of their ills to the forefront so that everyone sees the negative aspects of the person. As this person is talking about people and nobody knows it, and people are sharing sensitive matters with the person, and the person, people are sharing sensitive matters with the person, and they don't even know that this person's going to go and blab to this one and that one. So therefore, God wants to basically put a sign on the person, and that's tzoras. Ubezem Yushav Akofel b'pasuk Shamar Adam ki yavo or b'saro seis v'yavo or b'saro l'naigat tzoras tarti b'or b'saro lamalitz. It's a strange thing. It says a person who has on the skin of his flesh a mark, and there is on the skin of his flesh tzoras. V'yavo or b'saro. It's a phrase we already had at the beginning of the pasuk. Why would we have the phrase twice? El lomer lach, it's to teach. Sezehu haseis v'ashever ilu haya b'ishtora machshavos loy mazikim ki b'nokel l'rafosam. If these marks would be on a person of pure intents and pure thoughts, this wouldn't be a big deal. Ach mitzad would be easy to heal. Ach mitzad yosam b'or b'sarosh achote. Okay, nasu l'negat tzoras. But since they're on the skin of this sinner, all of a sudden it's tzaras. So he basically is saying that a person who has tzaras on their skin, and then they really have it, meaning that God is clearly bringing it to them as some kind of punishment. So the impact of these marks are far more significant than just contacting the dermatologist. So there's a lot of discussion among the commentators. So now if tzaras is considered a sign from God, a punishment from God, let's try to figure out what kind of sins get the response of tzaras. In Erechim, the Gemara says there could be 7 different reasons why a person gets tzaras. And all of them have some kind of proof from the verses. And Medrash maybe al asara dvarim. There's a Medrash that talks about 10 things that a person gets tzaras for. We're not going to get into all the esoteric hidden things in this discussion. We're going to focus more on that which is out in the open in the parsha. And he says he thinks that there are 3 components that are very much alluded to in these psukim of our parsha. Number 1, first, like we said already, this is the most famous one, that there's an association between the punishment of tzaras and speaking ill of others. Shkem pirish Rashi, lama korbanot tziporim, v'she'osen masa potit. Birds are brought birds are brought as part of the offering when a person is done with being a Metzora. There's a korbanos, sacrifices that he or she brings. And so Rashi brings down the significance of the birds is because this person has been doing so much chirping that was the reason they got tsaras in the first place. It's unclear if this is also considered to be a Twitter reference or not, but okay. Hasheni hu al gasus haruach shenemar v'lokach lamitaher eitz eres ve'zov. A second significant principle is that the tsaras comes for a spirit of haughtiness within a person. There's a mixture of types of wood used when the waters are sprinkled on the person with tsaras, and it talks about cedar wood and hyssop wood. If I'm not Azov hyssop, right? Azov, is that? Yeah. Piresh Rashi shemikbia atzmo ke'erez yashpil atzmo ke'azov. Also a famous Rashi. Rashi says that if the person held themselves up like a cedar tree, God is going to cause them to be humbled, or they need to humble themselves like a hyssop. So that idea in terms of the practices for the Metzora also speaks to that the issue is haughtiness. Number 3, Ashlishihu al tsaros ha'ayin. The third one has to do with a spirit of stinginess. Shenemar uva asher lo habayis. We're going to get into it later in the week, God willing, but there's tsaras that could be on someone's body. There's tsaras that could be on someone's clothing. There's tsaras that could be on someone's home, on the wall of someone's home. So when the Torah talks about the scenario when there's tsaras at someone's home, it says, and the one to whom is the house, context the Kohen. So there's an interesting quote from the Gemara on this, that this fellow has tsaras on his home because his attitude was asher lo habayis, that the house is for himself, meaning it's a general attitude of what's mine is mine, and it's for me, it's not for you, leave me alone. The Davos Kolo comment varim. When we talk about this attitude, there's many things included in it. It could be that desire for money is included in stinginess. There's a story in Navi about Geichazi with tsaras, that seems to be the connection. Hein hagezel shemanu razal sham v'rayasmi pasuk v'tzivah kohen nefinu asabayis v'tana hu kanas mamashenu shalo yavo kohen v'fazir memono. There's a quote from the Gemara that talks about maybe the reason why the person has tsaras on the home is because maybe the person took things that weren't his. It took money away from people. So now the Kohen is going to come and cause this person loss. So when you think about it, stinginess is connected to desire for money. Stinginess is certainly connected to taking money from others. Doesn't mean that if a person is stingy, they take other people's money, but you could make the connections in terms of the character. Ushlosha elim koram echad ki chemdas hamamon misavev gama gezel v'tzorosa'ayin. It says really the real core of theft and stinginess is tremendous desire for money. So it's an interesting kliyakar. So with the kliyakar, you can see he's pretty strong on the idea that tsaras is coming as a spiritual punishment. But it's interesting that he's created from the languages in our psukim, not even other examples in Tanakh, but from the languages in our psukim or things related to our psukim. He's really zeroed in on speaking ill of others, spirit of haughtiness, and too strong an association with money. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, God willing, and throughout the week.